to extend you a very warm welcome on behalf of both organizations, GLOBSEC and the OECD, in this high-level policy webinar focused on shaping a vibrant economic recovery in Central Europe. Today's event piggybacks on the OECD Going for Growth 2021 flagship initiative and report, but also on the GLOBSEC CEE Strategy Transformation Workstream with its signature tool, the Composite CEE Strategic Transformation Index. My name is Sonia Muzikarova. I'm the Chief Economist at GLOBSEC, and I will be gladly moderating today's session. A quick overview of how the discussion will be organized today. We will start off with high-level kickoff presentations by the state secretaries from Slovakia and the Czech Republic, and also the OECD. We have with us today State Secretary Ingrid Brodsková from the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs of the Slovak Republic, who is also a former ambassador and permanent representative to the OECD. Welcome, Ingrid. We also have Deputy Minister for EU Funds, Marian Piecha from the Czech Ministry of Industry and Trade. And last but not least, we also have a Secretary of State, Mr. Jan Oravec from the Ministry of Economy of Slovakia. Welcome to you too, and welcome to the GLOBSEC and OECD joint platform. Importantly, key findings of the 2021 Going for Growth will be presented by Mr. Luis de Mello, who is the Director of the Policy Studies branch at the Economics Department of the OECD. Welcome, Luis. And after the kickoffs, we will open the floor to a discussion. We have the OECD country desks with us today, who will be able to answer all of your burning questions regarding the policy recommendations made to your countries. And I very much look forward to this part and trust that it will be a lively and engaging discussion. So without much further ado, I would like to invite Madam State Secretary Brodsková to open this webinar and set the scene. Please, Ingrid, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Good morning to everybody, to all of you from Bratislava, dear fellow state secretaries, dear Luis, dear OECD colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really very pleased to open this webinar. I think what an excellent idea to put these two organizations together, OECD and GLOBSEC. I am extremely pleased that by this webinar, we are following the recent release of Going for Growth 2021 OECD publication, because this is one of the flagship publications of the OECD. And why? Because this publication regularly brings the comparison and guidance for structural reforms in the OECD countries. And especially this time, it is very important to read this publication because it's more vital, more critical because of the COVID-19 and the next phase, what is ahead of us. It's an economic recovery. And this publication very well frames the main policy challenges along three main areas, which is the building resilience, facilitating reallocation and boosting productivity growth for all, and supporting people in transition. What is really very good and what I appreciate very much that what is highlighted in this publication is also the need and necessity for international cooperation across the all sectoral policies. So it has been also my view for a while that it is high noon for strategic transformation in Central European economies to return them really on the course of dynamic growth and prosperity. The COVID crisis tested our health, our economies, our societies and policies, and at the same time, it serves really as a catalyst for progress, and really this crisis mobilizes the economies to accelerate the structural reforms and to to be able to have the capacity to respond better to the changing world. The countries of the Central and Eastern Europe, I can tell that they are lucky, or we are lucky, because we are members of the European Union, and the recovery and resilience plans, which are very robust in the European Union, have been turned in the last week in Brussels. Now we will be in the process to consult with the European Commission. All of these plans for all countries and EU as a whole represent really very good instrument and tool for change. They're also the opportunity and opportunity for transition of our economies. It is true that the importance of sound policy setting, timing, phasing, sequencing, communication of structural reforms, and fund absorption capacity is perhaps at its all-time high since the transition years in these economies. For Slovakia, the weak areas identified by database analysis, which are done by the OECD, the World Bank, the IMF, or the European Commission, where progress is necessary, include usually very usual suspects like education agenda, skills, innovation capacity, public administration efficiency, and arguably there might be potential also to think about the changing the economic model for some of the countries in this region. Therefore, I'm pleased that in attempting such complex and high-stake endeavor, that is the strategic transformation of our economies, we can lean against the robust policy work done by the OECD. And I am going back to my years spent in the OECD and really good experience what our country, Slovakia, had with the engaging of the OECD in the structural reforms in Slovakia. I think there is a huge potential, and I very much hope that we will engage the OECD also in the recovery plan after the COVID-19, because there are many areas where we can where we have good examples and we can build on them, especially in Slovakia, because we are the country still which lacks the analytical capacity in the line ministries, and the OECD is really the place where we can really learn a lot of good practice how to formulate the structural and sectoral policies. Good examples of our cooperation are, I will name only few, all aspects of education policy, employment policy, active labor market tools, how to motivate the labor market, environmental policy, public administration efficiency and integrity of the public administration. Then focus on vulnerable groups of society, women's participation in the labor market, then challenges in context of the Roma population in Slovakia. So I think there are really good examples how the synergy between the public administrations of the EU countries and the OECD can work, and we could really together to deliver the sustainable growth. GLOBSEC, on the other hand, rose to becoming a leading global think tank with a Central Eastern European focus. And I know that they have strategic economic transformation work stream on their own, including their unique index of strategic transformation, an important tool that ranks the economy's progress in relative terms. It pleased me that these two organizations, each strong in its own way, joined forces to create discussion platform for this extremely timely and important issue. So last but not least, I would like to extend a special welcome, first of all, to Luis from the OECD, a very good friend of mine, And also to my colleagues, Jan Oravec from the Ministry of Economy in Slovakia, and to State Secretary Mr. Piecha from the Ministry of Industry and Trade. So they will, these two gentlemen in our countries they will have a lot of on their shoulders to prepare the reforms and to make sure that they are implemented and that we will be able to deliver. So without further ado, I wish you best of luck and look forward to the forthcoming deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, dear Madam State Secretary, for setting the scene and for your encouraging opening. And I would like to straight away turn to the OECD's Mr. De Mello to bring us up to speed with the key findings of the Going for Growth 2021 report for these four economies, for Slovakia, Czechia, Poland, and Hungary. So please, Mr. De Mello, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sonia, for the introduction. Thanks, Ingrid, for your kind words, for highlighting all the very productive cooperation between Slovakia and the OECD. I just hope that we'll be able to travel again soon, so that we'll have the opportunity to see you here in Paris, or otherwise we'll see you in Bratislava. But it's a great to see you again, and a great pleasure to have Jan and Marian on this panel as well. I'll share my screen because I thought the best way to summarize some of the messages that we have in Going for Growth would be to share some graphs and with you, so that we can get the focus on the key issues that we wanted to highlight clearer, and then we can come back to that in the discussion. So I'll just share my screen. Here we go. I hope you can see the slides. Here we go.
Yes, it is nicely visible. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Sonia. So the key messages of Going for Growth are obviously related to the point in time our economies are, which is this period of tackling the pandemic and the drop in activity that is associated with it. What does it mean for the longer term? Well, one case is a risk of slower growth moving forward. If you see in this graph, we have basically, going back over the last 20 years, already a big shock at the time of the global financial crisis that has a cost to potential output in our economies. And we see more recently, as a result of the pandemic, another drop in activity. So the risk that poses is that we may end up in a situation where we could have longer term scarring effects that would mean a permanent loss in output relative to what we had before the pandemic, which is what we observed at the time of the global financial crisis. Our economies collectively never got back to the trend level of GDP that we had if we had stretched that performance in the absence of the global financial crisis. So there is a risk that we needed to take into account and think of policies that can reduce that risk. And that's what Going for Growth is actually doing. Ingrid, you mentioned already the three pillars. I just wanted to come back to them in somewhat more detail. So the first one, that is about building resilience. When we are talking about the risk of a long-term scarring from a crisis, we need to think about options for making sure that we're reducing those risks, that we are minimizing these undesirable effects, and that we are improving the capacities of our economies to bounce back after that. So all policies related to healthcare, to automatic stabilization, to environmental policies, to infrastructure, to rule of law and governance are policies that are very much related to enhancing resilience. Then we have the second pillar, which is about enhancing economic dynamism. It's not only making sure that we are better prepared to face crisis, but that we can basically foster all the restructuring, the reallocation that may be needed for an economy to recover robustly following a shock such as the COVID-19 pandemic. So boosting innovation, how can we make sure that the business is as dynamic as it should be to foster the spread of innovation, to improve productivity, to make sure that we can grow on a sustainable and strong basis after the recovery. Promoting opportunities for entrepreneurs. A lot of making the most of innovation has to do with creating those opportunities for entrepreneurship in our economies. So what are the policies that can be thought of as drivers of enhanced dynamism? Well, everything that has to do with competition policies in product markets, facilitating entry and exit of firms, trade innovation, labor market policies, tax reforms, everything that has to do with creating favorable conditions and or removing obstacles that may be in place for dynamism. And a third pillar that you mentioned, Ingrid, is related to supporting people. So how can we make sure that we protect those groups that are most adversely affected during this period of hardship associated with the pandemic, but also to equip them with what is needed to make the most of their productive capacity once the recovery is firmly established. So everything that has to do with education and skills, everything that has to do with having the right tools in an increasingly digitalized economy, for instance, would be very important elements in this pillar of our policy priority exercise. So policies that have to do with activation, lifelong learning, formal education, specific training for workers, employment services are the immediate policy levers that can be used for that. So that's the overall rationale of going for growth, if you want. Let me zoom in on the 4 countries at hand, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia. What we see is that even before the pandemic, so abstracting from the immediate short-term effect on activity, even if you go back to before the pandemic, the 4 countries were converging gradually to the living standards levels of the best performing countries in the OECD area. So these are basically what's the level of GDP per capita relative to the upper half of the OECD countries. And you see that all the 4 lines were moving gradually up. But since the global financial crisis, they've lost the impetus that they had before. So this convergence process has lost some of its vigor, and that's one thing to bear in mind. What is it that is preventing those 4 countries from resuming the process of convergence at the pace that they were facing before? What we see is that if you decompose that gap in income relative to the upper half of the OECD area, what we see here is that what seems to be holding back the 4 countries is not so much the use of resources, it's not so much the employment rate, because you see on the right that the 4 countries already have employment rates that are very close to the OECD average. In the case of the Czech Republic, it's even above the OECD average. Oops, sorry. But there is a bigger gap in terms of productivity levels. So the level of output per hour worked, although they have been rising over time, and that's essential to convergence, we see that there is still a large gap in the neighborhood of 40–30% of the level in the upper half of the OECD countries. So a big chunk of the convergence story has to do with catching up in terms of productivity. I mentioned that the problem of employment is not so big on average, but let's not forget specific social groups that are affected. And then you can see that if you look at mothers with young children, for instance, or if you look at the longer term unemployed, then the performance of the 4 countries is somewhat different. And we see that there is still some gap to be filled on both scores, right? Relative to the OECD area as a whole. So I'm mentioning this because that's one point that I'm going to come back to as one of the policy priorities. But another area where we still see a gap in the 4 countries relative to the OECD has to do with sustainability, which is another very important angle to economic performance. And if you think of sustainability as regards the environment, then we see that again there is some way for improvement in the case of the 4 countries. Take the share of population exposed to air pollution, in particular fine particulates, which is one of the most relevant benchmarks that we have in that area. Then we see that the situation is much worse in the 4 countries relative to the OECD area, with a much higher share of the population affected by exposure to air pollution. Greenhouse gas emissions. You see that on a per capita basis, it has been fairly stable over the last 20 years in the countries, in the 4 countries. So some room also to improve performance in that area. Granted, the performance of OECD countries hasn't been stellar either. There is a lot to do also for the other OECD countries, but we see that in the 4 countries there is still somewhere to go. A large share of emissions remains underpriced in the 4 countries. If you see in this chart relative to the green bar for the OECD, still some way to go in that area as well, as a way of making sure that that emissions are appropriately priced. Long way to go also for the OECD countries as a whole, but the 4 countries fare even less favorably than the remainder of the OECD. So let me turn to the key messages of going for growth. What you see in this chart is essentially all the range of policy priorities that are identified when we benchmark outcomes against policies. That's the objective of going for growth, right? Is to see where countries are in terms of outputs and outcomes, and see how policies, how far they are from good practices in terms of policies that are known to lead to improvements in performance in all those areas. Then we see that there are a number of important priorities in product market regulations, education and skills, activation, and Ingrid, you mentioned yourself a few of those. 2 areas that have become very prominent since the pandemic: the area of environment sustainability and the area of social benefits and healthcare, as is obviously the case given the nature of this shock. The policy priorities now for the 4 countries in particular are not very different from the rest of the OECD, but I would like to note here that you have about 30% of the policy priorities that have to do with labor markets, to improving performance in labor markets, improving employment outcomes. And you have another 60%, if you add product market regulations, human capital, R&D, digitalization, and public sector efficiency, you get about another 50% of policies that are really very closely related to efficiency, to productivity in our economy. So if you look back at that first slide about the gaps of the 4 countries relative to the best performance, we see that your policy priorities have to do with those 2 key elements: tackling employment gaps and also improving productivity. Let me focus one word on employment and social services. There you can see, for instance, issues related to retirement age for older workers. The 4 countries are still pretty much below the average of advanced economies. Some of our policy priorities for Hungary and Poland, for instance, are related to how you can link statutory retirement ages to gains in life expectancy, for instance. We know that our population are gaining in life expectancy, so how can we make sure that you can encourage older workers to stay on in the labor market by adjusting pension entitlements? Take the case of childcare. Remember a chart just a minute ago about the gap in employment for mothers with young children. So again, we see that the 4 countries also have some way to go relative to the OECD area, and we have specific recommendations for the Czech Republic, for Slovakia, in terms of access to childcare education, care for young children, affordable supply of affordable childcare facilities, and so on. All policies that we see on the basis of international experience that have an important role to play there. Education and skills, again, that's one area that the 4 countries have in common, how to make sure that we can increase investment and upskilling that would allow the labor force to be better prepared to face the challenges of an increasingly digitalized economy. Let me mention one word about the priorities related to pandemic. There we see, you saw that again in the previous chart, that a number of priorities have increased as a result of the challenges that we are facing. So in the case of the Czech Republic, issues related to pursuing greener forms of growth, in Slovakia, of strengthening innovation capacity, in Poland, to improve efficiency in healthcare, for instance, to tackle the challenges that have been exposed by the pandemic. These are all priorities that have come to the fore as a result of the crisis that we are facing, and that we have been, let's say, focusing on in somewhat greater detail in this edition of Going for Growth. Let me stop here, Sonia and Ingrid, if you allow me. We'll have an opportunity to come back. My colleagues on the desks are also present in the call and may help us address some of these issues. But I just wanted to invite you to check the page of the OECD, where we have not only the whole material and analysis related to Going for Growth, but also the specific recommendations and policies for each individual country of the OECD, so that it can give you ideas about what countries are doing, benchmark your own experience relative to other countries, in the hope that is ultimately our objective, that all these analysis, evidence, and data are basically here to inform your own policy choices and your own analysis at home. So it has been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity on behalf of all my colleagues and the teams that are involved in the Going for Growth work. Thank you very much, Sonia and Ingrid.
Thank you very much, Luis, for this concise overview of the progress, but also some of the economic structural challenges ahead for the region of Central Europe. You have definitely offered us a lot of food for thought into the upcoming discussion, and also I can tell that your Going for Growth findings are actually quite well aligned, especially the policy priority areas, with the pain points that we have identified as a part of our strategic transformation stream. For example, for Slovakia, the capacity to innovate and education and skills domain as the main priority areas. Absolutely, but we can talk about that a little later. And before we dive into a discussion, I would like to turn to the reactions of our high-level policy representatives, starting with the Czech Republic. So I would like to pass the floor to State Secretary Marian Piecha, who is the Deputy Minister for EU Funds at the Ministry of Industry and Trade of the Czech Republic. Please, the floor is yours. Do we have Mr. Piecha here? Okay. Well, maybe we can come back to Deputy.
Oh, the connection. Can you hear me?
Yes. Now it's fine.
To right microphone. Sorry for confusion. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm not an economist. Actually, I'm not even a policymaker. But I call myself a worker or scientist who has a laboratory equipped with 4 billion of European funds at the Ministry of Industry and Trade. There are all those 4 billion for Czech entrepreneurs. And as I see the recommendations and all the policymakers and great discussions, I would like to say that the competitiveness policies, as we were used to do 2 years ago, they don't work anymore. We need to stop and observe, maybe look out of the box. I very much like the presentation about the digitalization and all the policies created by R&D innovations. It's great, but let's just look it from the perspective of the COVID crisis. And for example, in digitalization, we have made wonderful progress with this lockdown and everything. I think this meeting is a great example of how we all progressed in digitalization, because we are meeting online, which never happened before the COVID crisis, and actually half of the Europe is working that way. So we made a great progress in digitalization. I don't think so that the manufacturing industry in the Czech Republic was even hardly hit because the manufacturing was locked only for a very short period of time. And as I see the projects of those companies financed from cohesion policy, they are actually without any changes. The entrepreneurs continue the projects, the innovative projects, R&D projects. Everything goes well in the manufacturing sector. Actually, I even see from the progress of paying those subsidies that in this field the entrepreneurs are even starting to run faster because they assume that with the tighter competition which can come with the crisis, as it was in the years 2008 and so, they really need to invest in innovations and to beat their competition. So they are applying for better and better projects as the tiger of crisis runs after them. But in the field of travel industry, service sector, I don't see any progress there. This sector is completely dead. There's no tiger running after those entrepreneurs. They are lying dead on the floor because they were closed for almost a year now. And I see this as a big problem in all our V4 countries because we have made our policies or R&D innovation, and it's great to continue in that. But we need to look out of the box. We need to start thinking about the whole economy. And with my discussion with the European Commission, just setting the goals only for digital and green is not enough. I think with the, and I'm very happy that it was shown in the presentation, that with the unemployment rates and everything, we also need to take care of the service sector and travel industry, because that what will show in the numbers of unemployment, and it will fall in the productivity or in growth of our economy. That was in the graph the same in 2008, not because we have not enough invested money in digitalization and innovation, but because we have killed our tourist and service sector. So definitely we need to all focus also on this part of economy. And I think we can also find the environmental aspect there, because my personal opinion is that in 2-3 years, there will be not too much opportunities to travel outside of Europe. We will not get out of the COVID so fast. So the idea to build the right tourism infrastructure, which you can reach in 2-3 hours of drive by car, is the right example for Europe, and it also has a great environmental aspect, because Personally, I don't believe that the tourists from China will come to Prague again shortly, and I don't see that the Czech tourists will fly to Sri Lanka for holidays. And that's only for Czech. I think all the other countries we are discussing right now will be in the same situation. And I see no progress, no involvement in tourist industry policies generally throughout anywhere. So sorry to be so specific, but I just wanted to state my message very clear that all our policies are great. Everything works well in the digitalization, innovation, that we are really making good progress, but we are forgetting something that's what I wanted to mention. Otherwise, everything is great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Piecha, for your valuable inputs. And I think just to add on what you have said, a part of the high-stake challenge will be balancing some routine expenditures with also some frontier expenditures to also increase economic resilience. So that will be definitely a part of the job and a hard part, I would say. But now I would like to turn to Mr. Oravec, the State Secretary of Ministry of Economy of Slovakia. Please, Mr. Oravec, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the floor, and thanks for organizing this event, also to GLOBSEC and the OECD. Thanks to Luis for his very interesting and stimulating introductory presentation. And when I was listening to that presentation, I've made basically 4 major remarks, and let me comment on these 4. Number 1, it's short-term performance of the Slovak economy. Number 2, long-term convergence. Number 3, productivity. And number 4, our policy response to what you call shaping a vibrant economic recovery. So these are the 4 parts of, or actually 4 comments. Let me come back to this short-term performance. We are 1 year into the pandemic, and now we can reflect upon the first figures. And 1 year ago, when we were making the forecasts, fortunately, we now see we were quite pessimistic, and the real situation and the real development was not that bad as we expected 1 year ago. And we can see that from our forecast from 12 months ago, when we expected that our economy would decline maybe almost by 10%. And real decline of the GDP was 5.2%. It is a little bit higher than the average of EU 27, where the economy declined by 4.7%. So we are a little bit worse than the performance of the EU. And partially this can be caused by the fact that our COVID-19 related expenditures were quite modest as compared to the other countries. And we are very frequently criticized as the government that we are not investing that much money to save the economy as the other countries. And it was about 1.5 billion 1.5 billion euros that Slovak government invested into COVID-19 specifically related expenditures. Then this modest approach reflected again in maybe better performance when it comes to the public finances. And our deficit was 6.2%, which is lower than the average of the EU 27, where it achieved almost 7%. And you know that we are also the member of the Eurozone, and the average deficit of Eurozone country was 7.2%. But again, we expected the deficit 11.6% 1 year ago, which means that the situation was not that bad, was not going that terribly as we expected 12 months ago. And then also it is reflected in debt we have currently, which is about 60%, 60.6% of the GDP, as compared to more than 90% debt of the EU 27, and even 98% of the debt, which is the average debt of the Eurozone member country. We expected a slightly higher debt, 62.2%. We have 60.6%, but it is not saying that we are performing very well, because it's a jump in terms of the debt. We used to have a debt of about 50%. So it's significant negative development there. All in all, when we see the performance of the economy, as I say, the situation reflected in public finances and a real development of the economy is not that bad as we expected. At the same time, maybe it is not, maybe it was partially caused by the fact that some negative consequences of the pandemic will be still materialized or will be demonstrated openly later on this year. So there are some negative developments within the economy, but it will take some time to see these consequences in terms of business closures, in terms of growing unemployment, etc., etc. So I'm a little bit nervous from this, maybe the wave of bankruptcies going on in next couple of months or in the second half of the year. We will see how the situation with the restrictions will go on and what will be the response of the business sector. So that's the short-term performance of the Slovak economy. On the long-term convergence, I must say that when I looked at your chart, if you would put that chart back, you would see very clearly that on the chart there is a time period of 2000 and 2020, 20-year time, and it can be from point of view of the Slovak economy divided into almost two equal halves. The first decade, 2000 to 2010, was a relatively quick convergence of the Slovak economy to the average of the OECD or to the EU average, whatever, to the developed world, we can say. But 2010 and 2020, we see that that dynamic of convergence, we lost that dynamic, and it's almost, we are not converging at all. And this is the real problem we see, and we have even formulated this as our ambition to the government declaration, that we want to come back to the more ambitious way of converging to the average of the EU or the OECD. And then, of course, that's the question, how to do it. And from my point of view, the crucial word, and that's my third comment, crucial word is productivity. And that is, again, one of the very worrying elements or the dimensions of the Slovak economy, that we are lagging behind the productivity of EU countries, and the EU as such is having a stagnating productivity as compared to the US, to some Asian countries, to main competitors of the European Union. So we are lagging behind those who are lagging behind the top of the performance of the world in terms of productivity. And that is why, again, we put into our government declaration as a big priority to focus our economic and social policies on competitiveness and productivity, and increase of competitiveness and productivity as the major priority of our policy making. the institutional part of how we want to achieve it is the Council for Productivity, for Competitiveness and Productivity. We will be establishing soon. And the major motivation behind that is exactly to focus attention of all policymakers, irrespective of ministry, on the task that is common to us to significantly contribute to increased competitiveness and productivity. And when we are talking about productivity, usually Ministry of Economy is perceived as the ministry that is having one goal in mind, which is business environment. And that is a narrow definition of the business environment, saying business environment is just administrative burden and better and more simplification of the legislative framework, etc. It is the very core of the business environment. But crucial for productivity is not only to have this good business environment in narrow sense, but also to address all elements of productivity, that factors that are crucial for productivity, as they were described by Luis in his presentation. And for me, it is number one, physical infrastructure, which is still Slovakia. The quality of the physical, basic, fundamental physical infrastructure is lagging behind the others. For your information, we still do not have two largest cities. It is the capital and the second largest city, which is in the eastern part of Slovakia. They are still not connected by the highway. And we are impatiently waiting for Hungarians to complete their part, the last 50 kilometers of their highway. And by that, Slovak capital will be connected by highway, but through Hungary. And we still have a couple of years to complete our highway on Slovak territory to connect Bratislava and Košice, two largest cities, with the highway. We have, when it comes to the railways, the trains running, I would say, maybe a couple of kilometers per hour faster than in 19th century. But it is only a couple of kilometers faster, So we are still dreaming about fast trains in terms of, France or other countries. We need to invest into this area. So it's physical infrastructure, business environment. And finally, the third element of productivity for me is the soft infrastructure. It's everything from a quality of public administration. It's everything from quality of the graduates of the schools, quality of the labor force, innovation ecosystem. So everything is very important, maybe intangible for some, but very crucial for productivity. And it's also the part of our thinking how to improve the productivity. So I'm coming to the fourth comment of mine, which is the policy response, how to tackle all these challenges. Well, because we are the member of the European Union, and unlike some other members of the OECD, we're going through this very challenging exercise, what is called resilience and recovery plan. And we have adopted the plan, and the government approved that last week. We sent it to the Brussels. And I can tell you that we have successfully managed to focus that plan exactly on the challenges that were described. So the plan is consisting of two elements. Number one, these are investments, and these are investments into what I described as the problem. So into the physical infrastructure, there are investments into the railways, investments into the greening, buildings, etc., etc. So the investments are there, and there are, of this, it's more than 6 billion euro that is going to be spent in next couple of years. And of these 6 billion euro, the 57% of them would be, or we expect will be invested into the digitalization of the Slovak economy and the greening of the Slovak economy. 57%, it's 20% for digitalization and 37% of that budget to greening of the economy. But it's only the first pillar of that plan, investments. The second pillar of that plan is reforms. And it's even if investments are difficult, the reforms are even more difficult. So we focus our reforms on, I would say, the reforming business environment in this narrow sense, and it is pure responsibility of the Ministry of Economy. What we have done already was that we have made the significant reduction of the administrative burden for businesses. Government and the parliament last year approved the first package of 115 measures to reduce administrative burden for businesses. We are now working on the second package that will be even more ambitious. We have 469 proposals. They are debated with other responsible ministries. And if the half of them will be finally approved, if we take that together with the first package approved in 2020, we will be having the most ambitious one-time reduction of the administrative burden for businesses in a modern history of Slovakia. So that's one way of improving the business environment. But we are also looking for more systemic approaches, how to prevent business environment from, adding the administrative burden in future. We are going to prevent future growth of regulation of businesses by adopting of one in, two out reform. That's the principle that we were inspired by the countries like UK, but also the Austria, Germany, Sweden, and others, that in their efforts successfully reduced regulatory burden by introducing the requirement for policymakers to reduce, if they are proposing the new regulation, they are expected to reduce equivalent scope of regulation under their responsibility. So it's, if you are increasing the regulation by 1 million, you are expected to propose at the same time its reduction by 1 million under your responsibility. And and it's good timing for this meeting, because that proposal that we prepared was approved by government just yesterday. So this is going to start to be implemented since the beginning of June. And since the beginning of the next year, January 1st, we will be having the next stage, which is this one in, two out. So the ministries will be expected to start reducing the regulatory burden for businesses. And we will be going through the ex-post review of the existing regulation, and we will be reducing it further and further. So they are very dedicated to that plan. But at the same time, we need to say that in the resilience and recovery plan, there are other ambitious reforms, and they are covering all important areas identified by Luis, starting with education, going through the public administration and judiciary. You know, the judiciary is a very critical element of the Slovak business environment. We have the very corrupted judiciary. We are in the process of cleaning it up. But at the same time, the Ministry of Justice is introducing ambitious reforms, which is a judiciary map, the efforts how to improve the efficiency of our rule of law. So these are the, and I'm not mentioning that last but not least, but the innovation is the big priority of that, because we didn't have a very good governance system in Slovakia for innovations. We are going to change that radically. to finally to get some good value for money, because a lot of money was invested in Slovakia for innovations with very weak results. So we hope that with the changing of the governance structure of that, this time it will be different. So hopefully it will be not just hope, but we will also meet that expectation. Final comment, just one example, because Luis mentioned as the important area also environment. And I think it's very relevant and very important, not only for businesses, but for the citizens. And I can tell you that the CO2 reduction is very important part of a recovery and resilience plan. So you have named as the problem underpriced CO2 emissions. What we want to do is not only to make more sense with the prices, but at the same time to reduce significantly the CO2 with the help of the funds from resilience and recovery plan. And we are maybe lucky, maybe unlucky, we will see that the CO2 problem is concentrated in a couple of companies. If you take 2-3 largest polluters in Slovakia, you will see that if we will help them to reduce their reduction, we will maybe solve 60 or 70% of the whole problem of the CO2 in Slovakia. So we expect a very big improvement also in this area. So thank you very much for your input. I think it was very interesting. It is very timely in terms of what we are doing. But also I want to say that we would welcome much more intense dialogue with the OECD and its analytical part on that most important element, which is productivity, because we have sort of catastrophic performance in that, and I would like to learn more about your insights specifically on productivity and on productivity of the Slovak businesses, and why is that we have 40% of the level of the EU, which is having just 60% of the level of the US. Thank you.
Thank you very much, State Secretary Oravec. So it's excellent that we're organizing this platform, which turns out to be very timely to be linking the analytical capabilities of the OECD with the needs of the Slovak Republic. Thank you also for your very clear 4 points and for mentioning some important initiatives such as the Council for Competitiveness and Productivity that cuts across the silos of various ministries and their responsibilities. I think this is also very much in line with the OECD's new approaches to policymaking, to not isolate via various policies and keep them with ministries, because the world and also policymaking is becoming so interconnected. And obviously also thank you very much for linking your intervention to the recovery plans, which is a very timely and crucial tool in the endeavor to achieve progress on the structural policy agenda. So thank you to all of you, dear state secretaries, and also to Luis. And I think we now have an abundant groundwork to move to the interactive part of the webinar, although we are running behind our schedule. So if you could stick around for another 10-15 minutes, we would very much appreciate that. Before I open the floor for a discussion, please remember we have the OECD country desks with us today. Also, we have a few media reps with us, so feel free to join the debate later on. Just a few quick housekeeping rules. Please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question or offer a comment. Otherwise, please keep your microphone on mute. Please introduce yourself, state your name, role, and organization. And please also keep your interventions short and on point so we can cover as much ground as possible. So I hereby open the floor for an expert discussion. I'm not sure I see any raised hands. If we could maybe start with Hungary. Do we have Mr. Szilárd Benk here?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Mr. Bang is the head of government finance methodology and statistics at the Hungarian Ministry of Finance, please.
Hello, thank you. So just a quick question, which may be answered by the Hungary desk, relates to the productivity of the Hungarian economy and relates to the so-called dual structure of the economy. By this I mean that the productivity of the SMEs lags significantly behind the productivity of the multinational companies. So I'm just wondering how the OECD sees this issue and how do they see the prospects of closing this productivity gap? Thank you.
Please, and you can seamlessly react to the questions. I will not be moderating and bridging that, so please go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Jens. I'm head of the Hungary desk. I suppose the question was for me. I think you pointed very effectively to the Hungarian problem that it's a dual economy. There is the export-oriented part of the economy that's owned by multinationals. There's high intensive in productivity, in profits, and they are capable of withstanding a lot of shocks. And then you have the other part of the economy, which is mostly SMEs owned by Hungarians, focusing on the domestic market. And they have low capital, low productivity, low capacity to expand employment. And as Louis pointed out, there's a lot of domestic policies that can be used to stimulate a more dynamic business sector, particularly competition policies. Hungary has, on paper, very good competition policies, but it's not used effectively enough to stimulate growth among the MSEs. A lot of SME support goes through giving them money, not through exposing them to competitive pressures. And you'll be able to read much more about this in the middle of the summer when we publish the next Hungarian survey. I think it's beginning late July. I hope this answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. And the next hand I see raised is of the State Secretary Oravec. So please go ahead. Or is that by coincidence?
Yes, I am here. Okay. Yes, I think that was a very good question from my Hungarian colleague, and I'm even referring to Slovak economy as not only having the dual structure, but what I'm usually saying that we have three economies and with a very different performance. The first economy, it's the big multinational companies having the factories in Slovakia and their tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, which is mostly automotive. So that's the first group. Very high performance, very high quality of the products, being very competitive. Second economy in Slovakia is the larger companies, and these companies, it's just several companies like multinationals and 200 or 300 of their suppliers. That's first economy. Second economy is several hundreds of larger companies having more than 250 employees, which is in Slovakia 600 companies. Not all of them in automotive, but these companies are larger and they are exporting already to the world economy, and they are again competitive. Everything is okay, high performance. But then the rest of the economy, which is almost 600,000 companies, are those small companies basically serving the local market, and there is the huge problem and the huge productivity gap. And I really am looking forward to the most intense dialogue with the OECD and those who are analyzing the productivity to get more insights, more detailed insights on the situation and what we can do with the improving it.
Thank you very much. Next up, I would like to turn to Mr. Branislav Relovsky, who is the head of fiscal and structural analysis at the National Bank of Slovakia. And I know that the National Bank has been conducted some structural review of their own, so they have a lot of fresh insights on the topic. So please, Mr. Relovsky, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the invitation and take an opportunity to discuss. As you said, we already prepared some structural challenges publication, and yesterday it was published. And in the following days also it will be available in English. My question is related to the convergence to the carbon neutral economy. And I would like to ask how this transformation of the economy to the carbon neutral could affect the catching up process in the seas so from this point of view. So thank you.
Maybe this is a question directed at the Slovak country desk.
Yeah.
Preferably, yeah. So please.
I think I would pass this on to our Going for Growth colleagues who have a better overview of the in general of the green growth agenda. I think this, I don't know if Tomek or Susanna are there.
Yes, hello. So of course, this is a challenge that's facing a lot of economies, not only the Central European ones. Now, if we, and we've done quite a bit of work looking into this issue of competitiveness and the green transition. And, the research shows that this is not necessarily to the detriment of the competitiveness, which is something that is often an issue in the Visegrad region. So there are policies, you can set up policies that will be relatively stringent, that will give the right incentives to your businesses to comply or to decrease emissions without necessarily harming the business itself. Of course, there's transition costs. Some companies will just not be able to make it. And this is where, the pillar of supporting people in transitions comes in, which is where the policy has to offer other retraining opportunities or has to create conditions in which in the new greener economy, there will be other opportunities for businesses to flourish. So new opportunities to develop and basically new jobs that can employ these people.
Thank you very much, Susanna. And we have had a question from Hungary and for the Slovak economy. And next, I would like to turn to Poland and pass the floor to Mrs. Iwona Borovík, who is an innovation economist at the World Bank, but she's dealing a lot with our Central European region. So Iwona, please, the floor is yours.
Oh, hello. Do you hear me? Yes? Thank you. Thank you very much. So I have a question related to digitalization. So because of COVID, there's this push for digitalization, which also calls for relevant skills. So given that education system has been behind due to online education, which probably will have impact on productivity, how the OECD could tell us about how the entire education system and respective curricula could be transformed and adjusted to global new trends. So this is the question about strategic transformation of education towards the new needs for new skills. Thank you.
Maybe a Polish country desk or whoever else is up for the task.
Yeah, hi, I'm Nicola Ruiz, head of the Estonia Poland desk. So yeah, that's a very good question, not only obviously for Poland, but for most of the economy. So we have to distinguish two things. I said adapting the school system. I think there's a very good example, and obviously I'm not quoting this because I'm also working on Estonia, on what's happening in Estonia and how they managed to introduce digitalization throughout their education system. Like, for example, kids who start to have coding course at the age of 7, and after continue throughout the years. So it's required major changes to how we think about education in these areas. But there's a lot of good practices as in Estonia, in particular, to create a mindset for digital technologies that students are acquiring with the new technologies and the new environment that has been transformed with social network and that kind of thing. But also, setting up the relevant course, I mean, can be done definitely through the education system. And there is also the problem of all the workforce that are out of school are working but lack the relevant skills. And for this, I mean, training, lifelong learning are essential tools to achieve this. This is what is recommended for Poland, which is clearly lagging behind in this area. So those are the kind of policies that can be put in place for this. Because I don't know, there are many examples, probably with an education expert. I know that our education directorate is working on this also. But this can be done. This has been done in other countries, and obviously I'm thinking about Estonia because this is the case in point in this regard. Yes.
Thank you very much. Oh, okay, go ahead, please.
Yeah. So this challenge is common for all the Eastern European countries. Specifically for Hungary, there was also very low preparedness for the need to accelerate the digital use during the pandemic. So, for example, the entire education system was not at all geared for distance learning. This includes that there was a lack of material, but there was also a lack of teachers that actually knew how to do distance learning. So, of course, during the pandemic, there's been a lot of on-the-job learning, but there definitely needs to be much more investment. And I think that how to digitalize an economy, I mean, there's not a single policy measure we can use, but I think that the public sector can be a driver by using as much digital technologies as possible to interact with the population. And that way it just spreads out, because we know that the large multinational companies, they know everything in this area. So again, it's a problem, not for the big successful companies, but for the small ones, and the public sector is also often behind the development that we can see in other OECD countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the exhaustive response. And I would like to take probably the last question from the audience. I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Jose Emilio Gumiel, who is a principal economist at the European Central Bank and who has also helped us and co-authored the GLOBSEC flagship Tatra Summit report and the STI index. So Jose Emilio, if you have any question or comment, please go ahead.
Thanks, can you hear me?
We don't hear you really well.
Okay, I will try to speak a bit along as I'm going to have with my laptop talking about digital transition. No, thanks a lot. I mean, just comparing the report, the OECD report with the STI, as Sonia flagged at the beginning, there are a lot of coincidences. So actually, it's a matter of different shades of the same goal. Something that in the report appears in the STI index, we put a lot of emphasis on innovation capacity, which is looking at the priorities given by the OECD in the different countries, doesn't feature in all of them. And I guess it's a bit of trying to capture the same thing. The OECD puts a lot of emphasis on education, as the index does, and also on competition policies that should foster this innovation. So somehow I think the question, everybody would like to be a very innovative economy, having high productivity, but the question is by when and how. Of course, if you invest in education, eventually you will be an innovation economy after 20 years, but I don't know if we can wait that much, or if we should be putting innovation it's not the case in all the countries. No? So that's something to think about. And then the STI flags in many countries that we should try to foster kind of high value added sectors inside the domestic economy, high value added sectors that should be pulling the economy through. Again, this is a kind of a medium-term objective, but I wonder, and of course, if you follow the OECD recommendations, I think that will come out after many years. But then again, I don't know if something could be done to get things, the benefits of these things earlier in the process. No? And I think that could be for the again, for instance, for Poland, the index, the STI index, pushes for further effort on digitalization and innovation, which do not feature in the priorities. Of course, in the priorities you have education and competition and regulation that again will deliver these things down the line. No? And then a different question, and this is more generic, is about what are the fiscal implications of all these things? Right now, in the current crisis, basically we have pushed the pause button. We are trying to keep things as they are. Of course, accumulating these public deficits and all that. Then eventually, but actually this crisis is lasting very long time. So we are 1 year here and we don't know what will happen. So I wonder what would be the fiscal constraints of the recovery to take this agenda. I have the impression that there is a lot of emphasis of, this is the domestic public finances try to, address the problems now, and maybe the future will be, delivered by for instance, the EU New Generation policies or program. So I was wondering what was your general view on this. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Jose Emilio. We haven't heard you very clearly, but from what I can gather, the question was, it's pretty clear that all of the Central European economies need to make tangible progress on innovation and innovation ecosystem. And the question is, how do we get there? What are some of the specific policy strategies that the Central European economies can design and implement to this end? I think that this was a part of the question. Then another part which is related was how can we foster the transition to a higher value added economy, which is something that's important in the next economic paradigm chapter of this region. And then I think Jose Emilio has also asked about what do we do in a broader scheme of things about the fiscal constraints down the road, given what's going on today in the context of the pandemic? So it's a threefold question, but if anyone would like to answer this, maybe just cutting through the countries as for a region as a whole. Anyone would like to take this challenge?
I can, Sonia, maybe have a go, and then I'll let my colleagues to fill in with their insights. So on the innovation, I mean, this is a recurring question that keeps coming up, how to set up a good innovation system. And as we heard from State Secretary Oravec, this is something that's very close to their heart. I think it's from my brief knowledge of the region, it's a question also in the other countries, and I've worked on Estonia, which has been pointed out by Nicholas as a kind of good country example, but they're also asking themselves the same questions. I think the advantage of these countries, and that has been said also earlier, or this multi-speed economy, structure of the economy can be turned also to an advantage of these countries. These multinationals have invested there, they are bringing they brought considerable know-how, they've trained their suppliers, they tried to look for local suppliers, they brought them up to certain standards. Very often, when you have this type of foreign direct investment, it's about how to capitalize on the spillovers to the rest of the economy. And this is where, if I think of the example of the Czech Republic, but I think in Slovakia it was similar before the pandemic, there were labor shortages of the skilled people appearing. And this is where the policymakers can clearly step in by providing the education that is needed. So I think that's one answer. I mean, I'm not an innovation policy expert, but my colleagues can come in with more country-specific recommendations on this. I think it's the nurturing of the business and university, or the academia and the business environment that can help to move these economies up the value chain and create more value added domestically. On the fiscal constraints down the road, perhaps I'll let Luis answer that question. I mean, the main response to the crisis is first to do what needs to be done now, and in a way, I don't want to say worry about it later, but the people, they need support where there is not. I mean, one of the lessons that we've learned is that number of groups of people were not covered by the social safety systems. So here, the policymakers, that they stepped in with the massive support, I think that was the right thing to do.
Okay, great. Luis, would
Sonia,
you like
yes, I would like to come in on one point. I think that it cuts across a lot of the discussions today. And I think that was motivated by Jan's point at the beginning about what is it that is needed to bring or to provide fresh impetus to convergence, to this process of catching up. And we saw that a lot of it is about increasing the rate of growth of productivity. And then at the beginning, Jens mentioned also in the case of Hungary, the issue of the two-speed economy, or these, feature of the four economies actually, of having, one part of the economy that is high productivity, that is growing fast, that is catching up with it, and another part of the economy that is not following. I think the issue here is that there is a parallel here between what's happening in the four countries and in other parts of the world. There is the issue of the loss of diffusion that we are seeing in productivity growth. We see that throughout the world, there are high productivity firms that are growing very fast, that are innovating, that are catching up, that are defining the frontier. And there is a growing number of firms that are basically lagging behind. It's this increasing gap between the frontier firms and the rest. There is a source for concern, because what it means is that there is something that is not working in the diffusion of productivity. So the diffusion of productivity is important for a number of reasons, because that's what allows, the average firm in the country to basically get the economy going, so to speak. But a lot of it has to do with this lack of diffusion. Touches on several of the questions that were asked. What's happening to innovation? Adoption of innovation by the firms that are lagging behind is what we are observing in many parts of the world as being part of the problem, meaning that it's firms that are falling behind in terms of productivity, that are failing to adopt these new technologies, that are failing to adopt innovation, that are failing to adopt digital technologies, that basically keeps them back, holds them back. So part of the problem of catching up is to make sure they create the right conditions for that not to happen, for the frontier firms to grow at the pace that they are growing, but for the others to catch up. So all the interventions that we mentioned before, and if you remember from those slides about, product market regulations that facilitates, business from the administrative side, but also make sure that there is entry and there is exit of firms in the most dynamic sectors in the economy. That's part of the diffusion of productivity and innovation. Training the workers. We talked a lot about innovation and links to the education sector, but it's more than the education sector itself. It's also everything that has to do with activation policies, everything that has to do with upskilling and retraining, lifelong learning, and all these aspects that could be in and of themselves, a whole new webinar that we could think of around those issues. That's what makes the task complicated, because it's not one single intervention in one area that will solve the problem, but the collection of interventions like the ones that we mentioned at the very beginning, that not only affect different aspects of the problem, but together create that externality that will, make sure that that process of convergence comes back. And taking opportunities of what's happening, increasing digitalization of our economies, that demands specific skills. Can we make sure that the labor force has those skills? Can we make sure that we deal with the transition costs that Susanna mentioned in terms of decarbonization? Again, there are very productive green firms that are doing very well. The problem is those low productivity, polluting firms that are not being able to catch up from the process of innovation, technological change that will affect. So how can we make sure that those parts of the economy not only don't lag behind, but don't become a drag for the other sectors by becoming a drag? How? By basically stranding capital that could be redeployed to more productive ends, by trapping workers in sectors and activities where the productivity growth potential is much lower. So that's all part of that first pillar of the Going for Growth strategy that I mentioned at the beginning, that is to do with creating resilience, but also the other two pillars, that is about protecting people in the transition and also making sure that you create the dynamism that is needed for that diffusion to take place, and that can be at the same time supported by that dynamism that can be created to a large extent by policy interventions. So sorry, I've been a bit long, but I think that was a way of probably connecting some of the issues that have been mentioned in a way that highlighted the logic of the policy priorities that we identified through Going for Growth that cut across the 4 countries and beyond some of the other economies in the OECD that we are observing that are facing the same challenge right now. But thanks for that opportunity, Sonia.
No, thank you very much, Luis. And I think, for example, the Slovak economy is a case in point when it comes to the huge gap in productivity between a few foreign-owned superstar firms and the rest, and the micro firms and the small and medium-sized enterprises, which is most of the economy. So there is definitely a huge gap to be bridged. But State Secretary Oravec had a remark. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I know that we are lagging behind the time, and we should probably come to the end of this. But let me raise one maybe very heretic thought at the end of the seminar, which can be a topic for the next seminar of this kind. And that heretic thought is this: when we are discussing the productivity, usually everybody says, well, the secret behind the productivity is innovation. And for me, not. For me, the secret behind the productivity can be entrepreneurship. And I was representing for 20 years the businesses, and I can tell you that it's a sort of myth of the industry of researchers on innovation saying innovation is everything. The secret of successful entrepreneurship is not being innovative entrepreneur. It is only few personalities like Steve Jobs or several innovative companies. The large majority of successful entrepreneurs are not innovators. They are fastly able to replicate innovation of others. So I have no ambition that Slovakia with the 5 million people will be global leader in innovation. But what I would like to see, to have the entrepreneurial skill within our population that would be very quickly able to replicate innovative models and innovations in technological advances globally here in Slovakia. So that's what just I wanted to say, that don't only mention the innovation as the secret. It is about entrepreneurship, even not innovative entrepreneurship, that is important.
Absolutely. I think this is a great point, very relevant, and to a large extent for this particular region is also about the ability to absorb innovations from elsewhere. But as State Secretary has pointed out, we are really running over time. Thank you very much for everyone for sticking with us. I still see a lot of audiences with us, so thank you. I would like to very quickly pass the floor to Zuzana Schmidova to do a few concluding remarks. And yeah, please, Zuzka, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Sonia. It's been a great discussion, and it should surely continue for much longer. But as number of you said, time is up. So let me try to highlight some main takeaways from this dialogue. As we heard at the opening, there has been a continued convergence in living standards. Much of the remaining income gap is due to lower productivity rather than resource use. So this is where the policy focus should be. Nevertheless, in terms of employment, the performance varies across social groups, and there's quite a lot of work to do in terms of environmental sustainability as well. State Secretary Brodkova highlighted the timeliness of today's discussion in the context of the European recovery plans, but also as an input for domestic policy analysis and development of reform plans. Deputy Minister Piecha pointed to the need to think out of the box in light of the pandemic impact. Despite the major progress in digitalization, he said that this is the right time to reset policies to maintain competitiveness of the 4 countries, in particular in the services sector. As we then heard from State Secretary Oravec, the short-term outlook is now better than it was a year ago, which is a good news, but there are still risks. And the dynamic of the catch-up before the pandemic has been lost. So to revitalize convergence, productivity growth will be key. And for this, both the hard and the soft infrastructure deserves policy attention. And then the discussion that we've just had revealed and touched on a number of points. And I think there was a wide agreement on the fact on the question of how to get the productivity convergence up, whether through the channel of innovation, digitalization, or entrepreneurship. So let me stop here. Thank you, Sonia, and thank you to all the participants of this seminar.
Thank you very much, Zuzka, and also thank you on behalf of GLOBSEC for being here today and for this valuable policy discussion. We'll be happy to do a follow-up someday eventually on a specific structural area. We're always happy to work with the OECD. I think the bottom line in this region is that it has a lot of work ahead of itself. It must do a significant leap forward on the transformation agenda, also using all the funds from the EU Recovery Fund to accomplish this. Of course, this is easier said than done, but it is definitely a once-in-a-generation opportunity that must be seized. So fingers crossed, and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.